Welcome everyone, today is Tuesday. We are approaching the beginning of our 6th reset of this season, and much like we did yesterday for Mythic Plus, it's time for our weekly update on how things have been going in the raid. We can take a look at how DPS or healers are performing in the raid, what's the popularity of the specs, if they have been doing better or worse compared to the previous weeks. We can check on the progression on the different bosses, etc, etc. So this week we haven't gotten, unlike last week, any particular hot fixes, any buffs, any nerfs changing certain specs. However, we do still see some changes. The biggest one, I would say, is the Vindication. Finally, fire mages can stop being called bottom tier, because now, technically speaking, they are only bottom half tier, no longer bottom tier. They went up a grand total of 7 ranks compared to last week, where they were dead last. So it's a massive improvement for fire mages. I bet they will be joyous of this change in ranking, much like the arcane mages, because the arcane mages also went up a grand total of 4 ranks to make it into the top 3, specifically second place at the moment being occupied by arcane mage. When it comes to the overall raid performance, we will see if it has to do with some particular bosses now killed by more guilds where arcane is doing particularly well. We do have a handful of other specs growing quite a bit compared to last week, like Arms Warrior going up quite a few ranks. We also see a little bit higher up towards the top, we do see Affliction Warlock, because once again this seems to have been going on for the whole tier. Different Warlock specs just randomly shoot to the top for like 1 or 2 weeks and then go all the way back down to the middle. This time is Affliction's turn, which previously was just chilling with Destro in the middle, and then this week now is the 4th spec in the raid. Other specs not moving by much are the 2 meaningful rogue specs, Outlaw and Subtlety, as well as Elemental Shaman, Shadow Priest, Devastation Evoker, and the 2 DK specs still towards the top. Same goes for the bottom. We still have specs like Marksmanship Hunter and Beast Mastery Hunter not doing that well. Feral Druid now joined also by Balance Druid towards the bottom, together with Windwalker Monk and even Havoc. Talking towards a race to the bottom, Havoc now is the 3rd least performing of the DPS specs. This is the performance as far as DPS is concerned when it comes to the overall performance out of all of the bosses. Talking about individual bosses, we can look at Neltharion in terms of performance. The average, yes, is still very low, because it's like on average 100 or so logs of specs killing Neltharion each, so it's not that many, but you do see that Frost DK is still towards the top like we checked last week. And talking about the specs that have been rising this week, you can see Arcane Mage doing quite well as Affliction Warlock doing quite well. Same goes for the previous boss before Echo of Neltharion, which is Magmorax. We have a few more logs of Magmorax. Once again, both of the DK specs are doing very well, and also Arcane Mage is doing quite well as well. Same for Fire, which was technically bottom place last week, but it's amongst the top half of performers when it comes to single target damage on Magmorax. And lastly, yes, this matters much less because there are much fewer logs for this. This is Sarkareth, the last boss of the tier, where you can see Arcane Mage actually being towards the top, in fact number 1 in terms of performance on this boss. Still, obviously, the number of logs for this boss are quite volatile at the moment. Healers, on the other hand, have not changed really from last week, ever since Preservation Evoker settled himself at number 1 and Restoration Shaman settled himself crashing down at the bottom. Basically, we have the same situation. We have Holy Priest and Holy Paladin in the middle, Restoration Druid and Preservation Evoker at the top, and then the other 3 specs towards the bottom, Mistweaver, Discipline and Restoration Shaman. The situation is still the same. What is also more or less the same is the popularity. So despite the change of value of certain specs, like Preservation Evoker doing much better and Resto Shaman doing much worse, it hasn't really changed the popularity of the specs. In fact, this week Resto Shaman even gains 1 spot over Holy Paladin. Obviously, as we mentioned multiple times, it's because it's not that players have a whole bunch of alts ready to reroll to mid-season. It's only been a couple of weeks since players realized that Preservation Evoker was very good compared to Resto Shamans, losing a lot of value. So it's not that tons of players have free ready characters to reroll immediately, so it's gonna take a while before we start seeing the changes when it comes to the popularity of the specs. Same could be said, same logic could be said for the DPS players, although for the DPS players is of course easier to change specs because multiple classes have multiple DPS specs within the same class, so it's much easier to see between 1 week and the next massive changes between Arcane Mage or Fire Mage, or between Destro and Demo, because all it takes is just one respec of talents and you're suddenly that spec, as opposed to healers where they would have to fully reroll to a different class unless you're playing Priest specifically. In here though, we can still see that despite Arcane doing much better, they haven't really gained that much compared to Frost Mage. They are still very close to each other. We also see some other pretty funny things in terms of niche performances. While we do still see Frost DK performing very well on certain bosses, they are still the third least played of the DPS specs at the moment. Same could be said, since we just mentioned their rise in performance, for Affliction. Affliction is performing much better, yet they are still the least played DPS spec in the game right now in Mythic Aberrus. I'm happy to see though, that after the initial tragic change to Skarn, which made the boss much harder to progress on for many guilds, now the curve has started to pick up a little bit compared to last week. Last week was a disaster. This week is, getting a little bit better. Still not as good, still not as smooth as the following bosses, like Magmorax, for example. Pretty smooth curve. Even Echo of Neltarion, pretty smooth curve. Skarn is getting better. We do have an interesting jump though, we do have an interesting jump in progression when it comes to Sarkaret. The progression curve was quite on the slow side until last week, and then suddenly it has started to rise significantly more, even though the boss itself hasn't really been nerfed massively or nerfed at all in Mythic, yet the progression now seems to be more smooth on this boss. Always funny to look at the amount of wipes of this last boss when you compare this to previous tough bosses like Razaget of last year, or God forbid the progression of Sepulcher, where Jailer, Rygelon, Anduin and Halondrus all had higher average wipes than Sarkaret, the last boss of this tier. So it's pretty funny to see the massive disparity on this boss, considering how more easy, how more accessible he is compared to what we have seen in previous tiers. So at this point in Season 2, we are 1 month in, and by this point we are probably halfway through, waiting for patch 10.1.5, which will bring more changes, will bring more reworks to specs like Holy Paladin, specs like Fire Mage, Frost Mage. Technically, we still don't know about it, but there should be some changes about rogues coming in the next patch. So basically, we are kind of just waiting now. We kind of have the general idea of which specs ended up being strong at the release of Season 2. We have gotten some surprises halfway through, like for example, Resto Shaman losing value, Preservation Evoker gaining value. We have seen specs solidifying themselves towards the top that weren't, that strong the previous tier. Specs like Devastation Evoker, specs like Unholy and Frost Death Knight. Nowadays seems like also Arcane Mage is doing much better. So this seems to be the situation right now, roughly 1 month into the tier. We will see if in the following weeks possibly more changes coming from Blizzard before the actual big changes of patch 10.1.5 will change something in the meta, in the power level of several of these specs. But for now, this is what we have available on our weekly recap as far as the raid performance of specs as well as the raid progression of the guilds goes. So with this out of the way, we are saying our goodbyes on the eve of our next weekly reset. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters. You know the drill by now. You can still support in 3 ways. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. And you can also follow me on my Twitter, as well as following me on my stream on Twitch. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, it's getting hot. I think we got it easy. These past few months were quite cold and chill, and I feel like now it's coming back to bite us all at once.